It wasn't about the money. For a man like Damian Blackwood, a titan of industry whose net worth eclipsed the GDP of small nations, an $857 restaurant bill was less than a rounding error. It was about a cold, unyielding principle. A principle that led him to publicly humiliate a young waitress over a single drop of spilled water. But he made one critical mistake. He assumed she was just another faceless servant in his gilded world. He never imagined that this exhausted, overlooked young woman held the key to the one thing his billions could never buy back: his own soul. And she was about to unlock it with two words in a language he hadn't heard in 30 years, his mother's language. Damian Blackwood did not dine, he presided. To sit at a table in a restaurant like Aurelia, the jewel of Manhattan's culinary scene, was not an act of leisure, but of conquest. The space itself bent to his will. The hushed whispers of other patrons died down when he entered. The maître d', a man named Charles who exuded an oily, practiced deference, practically genuflected as he led Damian to his preferred table. Table 12, a secluded corner booth with a panoramic view of the city lights and a tactical view of the entire dining room. He was a man carved from obsidian and ice. His suit, a bespoke creation from a Savile Row tailor, whose name was a secret whispered only among the elite, was a shade of charcoal so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. His hair was black, shot through with distinguished silver at the temples, cut with razor-like precision. But it was his eyes that held the true measure of the man. They were a pale Arctic gray, and they didn't just look at you. They performed an audit, calculating your worth, your weaknesses, and your utility in a single, dismissive glance. Tonight, he was dining with two junior executives from his monolithic corporation, Blackwood Industries. Their names were Mark and Peterson, or perhaps Peter and Markham. He neither knew nor cared. They were interchangeable, ambitious young men in well-fitting suits, their faces a mixture of terror and fawning admiration. They were here to be tested, to be broken or made over the course of a single meal. The Q4 projections for the Latin American Solar Division are conservative, Damian stated, not looking at either man. His gaze was fixed on the condensation trailing down his glass of still water. He didn't ask questions. He delivered verdicts. "Sir, we factored in the political instability in—" Mark began, his voice a half octave too high. Damian held up a single manicured finger. The motion was small, almost imperceptible, but it silenced the man as effectively as a gag. Instability is a synonym for opportunity. Your projections show a failure of imagination. Rectify it. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," both men mumbled in unison, shrinking in their seats. The rest of the meal proceeded along these lines. It was less a dinner and more a vivisection of their careers. Damian ate with a detached, mechanical precision, his palate so refined that he could detect the slightest imperfection. The seared foie gras was a degree too cool in the center. The microgreens on the pan-seared scallops were arranged with insufficient symmetry. He didn't complain. He simply made a mental note. Imperfection was a virus, and he was vigilant about containing its spread. He saw the world as a complex machine. Most people were simply faulty cogs, inefficient, emotional, and prone to error. His own life was a testament to the ruthless elimination of such flaws. He had clawed his way up from an impoverished, forgotten background he had long since buried, propelled by a singular, burning ambition. He had shed his past like a snake sheds its skin, erasing every trace of the hungry boy with a thick accent who had arrived in this country with nothing. He had no family to speak of, no real friends, only assets and liabilities. His mother, the last link to that old world, was long dead. He had paid for the finest care, the best doctors, but he had not been there at the end. Business, as always, had called. As the main course plates were being cleared, the incident happened. It was so minor that a normal person would not have even registered it. A young waitress, moving with quiet efficiency, reached for his water glass to refill it. As she poured from the heavy glass bottle, a single errant drop escaped the stream. It arced through the air and landed with a faint tick on the polished screen of his smartphone, which lay face up beside his plate. The world did not stop. The conversations around them did not cease. But at table 12, the temperature dropped by 20 degrees. Damian Blackwood's Arctic gray eyes slowly lifted from his phone, and fixed upon the waitress. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his silent, frozen fury was a physical force. The two young executives froze, their forks halfway to their mouths. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Lily, felt his gaze like a shard of ice pressed against her skin. Her hand trembled slightly as she finished pouring the water. "My apologies, sir," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She reached for a napkin to wipe away the tiny bead of water. Damien's voice when it came was soft, almost silken, which made it all the more terrifying. "Don't touch it." Lily froze, her hand hovering over the table. She looked from the phone to his face, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger, it was something far worse. It was the chillingly calm contempt of a god for a clumsy mortal. He slowly picked up his own linen napkin, wiped the single drop of water from his phone with a deliberate, almost surgical motion, and then placed the napkin on the table as if it were now contaminated. He looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. "Leave us," he said. The word leave was an execution. Lily nodded, her face pale, and retreated from the table, feeling the burning stares of every patron who had noticed the silent, brutal drama. She had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. And she knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in her stomach that for a man like Damien Blackwood, there was no such thing as a small mistake. Lily Grace felt the phantom weight of Damien Blackwood's gaze long after she had escaped the magnetic pull of his table. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the service station, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Around her, the controlled chaos of a high-end restaurant Saturday night service continued unabated. The clatter of silver, the murmur of conversation, the distant sizzle from the kitchen. It was a symphony she was usually a seamless part of, but now it sounded jarring and distant. She was not a career waitress. This was her means to an end. 4 nights a week, she donned the starch black uniform of Aurelia, tied her auburn hair into a severe bun, and became a ghost, attentive, efficient, and invisible. The rest of her time was spent in the dusty libraries of Columbia University, where she was 3 years into a grueling linguistics doctorate. Her focus was on endangered Uralic languages, a passion inherited from her late grandmother, a formidable woman who had fled Hungary during the 1956 uprising and had filled Lily's childhood with sad, beautiful songs and stories in a language that felt like home. Her work at Aurelia paid her rent on a shoebox apartment in Washington Heights and funded her research. It was a draining existence. The physical exhaustion of being on her feet for 10 hours was matched only by the mental exhaustion of constant code switching, from academic discourse on phonological shifts to debating the merits of the Cabernet Sauvignon versus the Merlot with a hedge fund manager who wouldn't know the difference anyway. She was good at her job because she was a good observer. She could read a table in seconds. The nervous young couple on a first date, the boisterous business celebration, the quiet, somber anniversary of a widowed regular. She learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to navigate the complex egos of the city's elite with a blend of humility and unshakable competence. But Damien Blackwood was different. He wasn't a person. He was a weather system, a low-pressure zone of absolute power that warped the atmosphere around him. From the moment he'd walked in, she'd felt it. She'd seen how his 2 young companions flinched when he moved, how the usually unflappable Charles, the maître d', scurried around him like a nervous courtier. Serving him was like trying to disarm a bomb. Every movement had to be perfect, every gesture flawless, and she had failed. 1 drop of water. Charles appeared at her elbow, his face tight with anxiety. "What happened, Lily?" A drop of water spilled on his phone when I was pouring," she whispered, her throat tight. Charles closed his eyes for a second, a pained expression crossing his face. "On his phone? Oh, Lord. Do you have any idea who that is? That's Damien Blackwood. He owns the building we're in. He probably owns the company that made the water bottle. He could buy this restaurant and turn it into his personal shoe closet on a whim." "I apologize," Lily said, her voice small. "Apologies don't work on him," Charles hissed, straightening his tie nervously. "He operates on a different plane. Just stay away from that table. I'll have Thomas handle them for the rest of the night. We'll just pray he doesn't mention it in his review. A bad word from him could sink us." Lily nodded, feeling a hot flush of shame and fear. Getting fired from Aurelia would be catastrophic. It wasn't just the money, it was the network of under-the-table catering gigs and event work that came with it. Losing this job could mean the end of her PhD. The weight of her student loans, her rent, her grandmother's lingering medical bills, it all pressed down on her, all because of a single, impossibly significant drop of water. For the next hour, she moved through her other tables in a daze. She smiled, she took orders, she described the dessert specials, but her mind was elsewhere. Her eyes kept darting back to table 12. She watched as Thomas, the most senior waiter, approached with the cautious deference of a man entering a lion's cage. He cleared their dessert plates, offered coffee. The two executives looked miserable, their faces pale under the restaurant's soft lighting. Damian Blackwood remained impassive, a marble statue of a man, occasionally glancing at his phone, his thumb swiping across the now pristine screen. Lily knew the moment of truth was coming. The check. She watched Thomas present the leather-bound bill folder. He placed it discreetly on the edge of the table, as was custom, and began to retreat. Damian didn't even look at it. He simply raised his eyes to Thomas. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," he said, his voice carrying across the now quieter dining room. Thomas paused, confused. "Sir?" "I won't be paying this," Damian stated. It was not a request or a negotiation. It was a declaration. A collective silent gasp seemed to ripple through the nearby tables. The two executives looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. Thomas was frozen solid. Charles, who had been watching from across the room, immediately swooped in, his face a mask of pained placation. "Mr. Blackwood, is there a problem with the bill? Any charge you find unsatisfactory will be removed immediately." Damian leaned back in his booth, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "The bill is not the problem, Charles. The problem is the service. The problem is the standard." He picked up the now clean phone from the table. "I come here for perfection. I pay for an experience devoid of clumsiness, of amateurish mistakes. Tonight, your staff demonstrated a lapse in that standard, a careless, sloppy error." He glanced in Lily's direction, and though he didn't point, everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. "I do not reward incompetence. It is a matter of principle." The humiliation was a physical blow. Lily felt as if he had slapped her across the face in front of the entire room. It wasn't about the water. It was about power. He was making an example of her, of the restaurant. He was reminding everyone in the room who he was and how insignificant they were. "Sir?" Charles stammered, his professional veneer cracking. "It was a minor accident. The girl is new, Do not make excuses for her," Damian cut in, his voice like chipping ice. "Excuses are the currency of failure. The bill is $857.64, a paltry sum. But my principles are not for sale, not for any price. We're leaving." He stood up, his tall frame commanding the space. The two executives scrambled to their feet, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Damian Blackwood adjusted his cufflinks, gave the room one last, dismissive glance, and began to walk toward the exit. He was going to walk out, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Lily's career, the restaurant's reputation, all collateral damage in his casual display of dominance. And in that moment, something inside her, something that had been dormant and weary, finally snapped. The dining room of Aurelia was trapped in a state of suspended animation. Forks hovered over plates, conversations hung unfinished in the air. The only sound was the funereal tap of Damian Blackwood's Italian leather shoes on the marble floor as he walked toward the door. Charles, the maitre d', stood utterly defeated, his face ashen. The two junior executives trailed in Damian's wake like frightened pilot fish. For Lily, time seemed to slow down. She saw her future spooling out in a grim, accelerated montage. Charles telling her not to come in tomorrow, the desperate search for a new job, the mounting bills, the deferred dream of her doctorate turning to dust. It was all so crushingly unfair. She had worked flawlessly for months, enduring condescension and exhaustion with quiet professionalism. Now it was all to be undone by the whim of one pathologically arrogant man. He was passing her station now. He didn't even grant her a glance. To him, she was no longer a person. She was a faulty component that had been identified and was now being discarded. The injustice of it burned hotter than shame. It wasn't just her job he was taking. He was stripping her of her dignity, reducing her to a public lesson in his cruel philosophy. And then she heard it. As he passed, he muttered something under his breath to one of his assistants, a curt, dismissive phrase. It was in English, but the cadence, the subtle vowel pronunciation, the ghost of an accent he had spent a lifetime sanding away, it was there. A faint, almost imperceptible echo. It was a sound she knew intimately, a sound that lived in the deepest recesses of her memory. The sound of her grandmother's voice. It was a long shot, a wild, desperate gamble born of having nothing left to lose. Before her conscious mind could veto the impulse, her body was already moving. She stepped out from behind the service station, directly into Damien Blackwood's path. He stopped, barely an inch from her. His two assistants flinched back as if she had pulled a knife. Damien's eyes, which had been fixed on the exit, slowly lowered to her. The look on his face was not anger. It was a profound, chilling bewilderment, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken to him. "Move!" he said. The single word was packed with enough menace to make a lesser person crumble. Lily's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her voice, when it came out, was a reedy whisper, but it was clear. Speaking softly in Hungarian, she said, "The heart remembers." The world stopped. It wasn't just the words. It was the accent. Perfect, unforced, native. The soft, melodic sounds of Hungarian, a language of poetry and melancholy, felt utterly alien in the sterile, opulent air of Aurelia. Damien Blackwood froze. Not just his body, but every micro-expression on his face. The mask of icy control didn't just crack, it shattered. His Arctic eyes widened, the pupils dilating. For a split second, the billionaire titan of industry vanished, and in his place was someone else. A startled, haunted boy. His two assistants exchanged panicked, confused glances. Charles started to move forward, to pull Lily away, but he stopped when he saw his employer's face. "What did you say?" Damien's voice was a rough, strangled sound, unrecognizable from the smooth, cutting baritone of moments before. Lily took a shaky breath, her courage solidifying. She looked him directly in the eye, holding his stunned gaze. She completed the phrase, her grandmother's favorite proverb, the one she would recite while stroking Lily's hair as a child. She whispered the old Hungarian proverb her grandmother had taught her. The heart remembers what the mind forgets. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than any sound. Damien stared at her, his lips slightly parted. The phrase had struck him like a physical blow, bypassing decades of meticulously constructed defenses and hitting something ancient and buried. It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 30 years. He didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw a ghost. He heard an echo, the scent of paprika and cabbage, the feeling of rough woolen blankets in a cramped apartment, the sound of a woman humming a mournful lullaby. It all came rushing back in a disorienting, nauseating flood. His mother. The word was a phantom on his tongue. The woman who had spoken those exact words to him 1,000 times. The woman whose memory he had systematically excised from his life story, deeming it a liability, a weakness. The bustling restaurant, the 857 bill, his so-called principles, it all evaporated. He was standing in a different time, a different place. He was a small boy again, shivering in a Budapest winter, and his mother was holding him, whispering that exact phrase into his ear as a promise and a warning. "How?" he finally managed to ask, the word broken. He spoke it in English, but his mind was screaming in Hungarian. "How do you know those words?" His entire demeanor had changed. The predator was gone. In his place was a man who looked utterly, terrifyingly lost. He had built an empire on the foundation of forgetting, and this young woman, with a few simple words, had just dynamited that foundation to rubble. The name he had shed was not Damien Blackwood. It was Daniel Fakit. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in over 3 decades. It belonged to another life, another person, a skinny, dark-haired boy who lived with his mother, Ilona, in a crumbling 2-room apartment off Váci Street in Budapest. Their world was circumscribed by the lingering scent of coal dust and the gray, oppressive sky of the late Soviet era. Ilona was a seamstress, her fingers calloused and perpetually pricked, but they moved with the grace of a concert pianist, turning scraps of fabric into dresses that brought a flicker of color to their drab world. Daniel was her entire universe, and she was his. His father was a ghost, a man who had chosen freedom by escaping to the West years before, leaving behind nothing but a faded photograph and a hole in their lives. Ilona never spoke of him with bitterness, only a weary sadness. "He wanted a bigger world, Daniel," she would say, her needle flying. "Some birds aren't meant for small cages." But their small cage was filled with a richness that money could not buy. It was filled with the Hungarian language. Ilona spoke a poetic, vibrant Hungarian, full of earthy proverbs and lyrical turns of phrase. She taught Daniel to read from the works of Petofi and Irani, to see the soul of their nation in the cadence of its words. Their language was their fortress, their secret garden in a world of concrete and conformity. And her favorite proverb, the one she used for every occasion, when he forgot his homework, when he scraped his knee, when he worried about their future, was always the same. The heart remembers what the mind forgets. It was her philosophy, her faith. She believed that the essential things, love, kindness, heritage, the sound of your mother's voice, were etched into the heart, immune to the forgetfulness of time or ambition. But Daniel's ambition was a ravenous fire. He watched the rare Western tourists on the street, with their bright clothes and easy laughter, and felt a profound, aching hunger. He didn't want a small cage. He wanted the world his father had sought. He devoured smuggled English language books and newspapers, practicing his pronunciation in secret, the sharp, angular sounds of English feeling like a weapon he was forging. When the Iron Curtain finally crumbled, the door to the world creaked open. Daniel, now a fiercely intelligent and driven teenager, saw his chance. He earned a scholarship to a university in America. Ilona was ecstatic and heartbroken. She worked her fingers to the bone, sewing for weeks to make him a new suit and buy him a plane ticket. The night before he left, she held his face in her hands. Her eyes were bright with tears. "Don't forget who you are," his mother had told him in Hungarian. "Your language is your home. Carry it with you." He promised he would. It was a lie. America was a shock and a revelation. He was Daniel Fakit, the poor Hungarian kid with a thick accent and cheap clothes. He was mocked for his name, for his stilted English. The shame was a physical burn. So he began the systematic process of erasure. Daniel Fakit died, and Damien Blackwood was born. He anglicized his name, flattened his accent with ruthless dedication, and severed ties with everyone from his old life. He sent money home to his mother, of course. Large sums at first. But the letters became less frequent, the phone calls shorter. Her loving, rambling Hungarian felt like an anchor, holding him back from the sleek, fast-paced world he wanted to conquer. He would answer her in English, his voice cool and distant. He could hear the confusion and hurt in her voice, but he ignored it. It was a necessary sacrifice. The last time they spoke, she was ill. The doctors in Hungary were concerned. She pleaded with him to come home, just for a week. "I miss you, my little boy," she'd said softly in her native tongue. Damien had been in the middle of a hostile takeover of a rival tech firm. It was the deal that would make him a billionaire. "I can't, Mother," he'd said, his voice clipped, impatient. "I'll wire more money for better doctors, the best in Germany." "I don't need your money, Daniel. I need you." "We'll talk next week," he had said, and hung up. She died 2 days later. The news came via telegram. He didn't go back for the funeral. The deal was at a critical stage. He sent a vast sum of money to handle the arrangements. He told himself it was the practical, logical thing to do. He told himself she wouldn't have wanted him to jeopardize everything he'd built. He told himself the mind had to be stronger than the heart. He had successfully, brutally forgotten. Until now. Standing in the opulent dining room of Aurelia, The waitress's words echoed not in the room, but inside the sealed, tomb-like chambers of his memory. Esiv emlexik. The heart remembers. Her voice was not his mother's, but she spoke his mother's truth. And in that instant, the ghost of Ilona Faketa was standing right there at the table with him, her eyes full of sorrow and love, her presence more real than the millions in his bank account. The principle he was standing on wasn't one of strength and perfection. It was a pathetic, flimsy shield he had constructed to hide his deepest shame, the betrayal of his mother, his heritage, and himself. The weight of that 30-year-old lie came crashing down on him, and for the first time since he was a small boy, Damian Blackwood felt the terrifying, gut-wrenching sensation of being completely and utterly exposed. The spell that had frozen the dining room finally broke, not with a crash, but with Damian Blackwood moving. He gestured numbly toward the table he had just abandoned. "Sit," he said, his voice hoarse. It was an order, but it lacked its usual steel. It sounded like a plea. He walked back to the booth and sank into the leather seat, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. His two executives, utterly bewildered, remained standing like statues. "Not you," he rasped, waving a dismissive hand at them. "Wait outside." They practically ran from the room, escaping the incomprehensible emotional vortex that had just opened. Lily hesitated for a moment. Charles gave her a wide-eyed, panicked look that screamed, "What have you done?" But she ignored him. She walked to the table and slid into the chair opposite Damian Blackwood. The fine leather was cool against her skin. The remains of a fabulously expensive meal sat between them like artifacts from another reality. For a long moment, Damian just stared at her, his arctic eyes now clouded with a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. The ruthless titan was gone. The man before her looked haggard, ancient, and profoundly fragile. He whispered in Hungarian, "Say it again." Lily obeyed, speaking again in Hungarian. The heart remembers what the mind forgets. Her own voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. He closed his eyes, a shudder passing through his powerful frame. "My mother. She used to say that." He opened his eyes again, and they were glistening with unshed tears. The sight was so shocking, so fundamentally wrong, that it felt like watching a mountain weep. "Who are you? How can you possibly know our language?" "My grandmother was from Szeged," Lily explained, her voice finding its rhythm. "She came here in '56. She never went back. She raised me after my parents died. She only ever spoke to me in Hungarian. She said it was the only inheritance she had to give." The simple, unadorned truth of her story was more devastating to him than any accusation. This young woman, a stranger, had cherished the very thing he had violently discarded. She wore her heritage not as a burden or a mark of shame, but as a gift. "She gave you a kingdom," Damian said, his voice thick with emotion. He switched fully to Hungarian, the words rusty and aching on his tongue, as if being pulled from a deep, painful well. "I threw mine away," he murmured. They sat in silence for another minute, cocooned in a language that no one else in the room understood. It was an island of shared history in a sea of confused onlookers. The other patrons began to whisper, sensing the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Finally, Damian seemed to gather himself. He looked down at the bill still lying on the table. 857.64. A number that had, 20 minutes ago, represented a principle of perfection. Now it looked like a pathetic monument to his own arrogance. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a pen, an old-fashioned, expensive fountain pen. He opened the book, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't write out the check to Aurelia. He wrote it to Lily Grace. He paused, the pen hovering over the paper. He looked up at her, and his gaze was raw, stripped of all artifice. "What is the tuition for a linguistics doctorate at Columbia?" he asked, his English returning. Lily was stunned. I don't know the exact total. It's over 100,000 for the whole program." He nodded and began to write. He wrote with a focused intensity, the scratching of the pen the only sound between them. When he was finished, he tore the check from the book with a sharp, clean sound and pushed it across the table. Lily looked down. He had written the check for $250,000. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the number. at the zeros that seemed to mock the balance of her own meager bank account. She couldn't speak. "That should cover your tuition, your loans, your rent," Damien said, his voice flat. "Consider it an apology for the spilled water, for my behavior, for—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the true nature of his debt. He then took out his wallet, extracted a sleek black credit card, and placed it on top of the bill folder. "Charles," he called out, his voice regaining a sliver of its old authority. Charles scurried over, his eyes wide as saucers, darting from the check in Lily's hand to Damien's face. "Run this card," Damien instructed. "Add a $20,000 tip, to be shared amongst the entire staff tonight, and bring me the receipt." Charles blinked, dumbfounded, then nodded and practically snatched the folder from the table, scurrying away as if afraid Damien might change his mind. But Damien Blackwood wasn't finished. His business with the restaurant was concluded, but his reckoning had just begun. He looked at Lily, a man adrift, searching for a landmark. "You said your grandmother was from Szeged," he said in Hungarian. "My mother was from Pest. She loved the gerbo kukrasta. She said they made the best dobos torta in the world." A flicker of a real, genuine smile touched Lily's lips. "My Nagi mama always said the best was at Roosworm." For the first time that night, a sound that was almost a laugh escaped Damien's lips. It was a dry, rusty sound. "A classic rivalry," he murmured. He looked down at his hands, at the manicured nails and the gold signet ring. They looked like the hands of a stranger. "I haven't had Dobos torta in 35 years. He looked back at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was absolute. You reminded me of something I paid a fortune to forget. Thank you." The words, so simple, were the most profound admission of failure from a man who never admitted anything. He hadn't just been refusing to pay a bill. He had been refusing to acknowledge a debt to his own past, a debt to his mother's memory. And in a bizarre twist of fate, a waitress in a New York restaurant had just handed him the invoice. Damien Blackwood left Aurelia a different man than the one who had entered. The change was not visible in his stride, which was still long and purposeful, or in the severe cut of his suit. It was internal, a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of his soul. The city lights of Manhattan, usually a glittering testament to his power and success, now seemed cold and alien. For the first time in decades, he felt homesick for a home that no longer existed. He dismissed his driver and chose to walk. The crisp autumn air felt sharp in his lungs. The sounds of the city, the blare of horns, the distant wail of a siren, the chatter of pedestrians, were a familiar symphony, but tonight he heard a new, dissonant note within it, the sound of his own hollowness. Every step was a penance. He had built his empire by being a man of action, of ruthless forward momentum. Looking back was a weakness he could not afford, but now the past was all he could see. The memories unlocked by Lily's voice played in a relentless, vivid loop. His mother's hands kneading dough for langos. The sound of her laughter as they danced in their tiny living room to a crackling radio. The smell of her cheap perfume. The unbearable pain in her voice during that final, truncated phone call. He had told himself that providing for her was the same as loving her. He had believed that success was the only apology his impoverished past required. He saw now the profound, arrogant lie in that equation. He had given her money, but he had withheld himself. He had built a fortress of wealth around a vacant heart. He stopped in front of a darkened storefront, looking at his own reflection in the plate glass. The man staring back was a stranger. Damien Blackwood, the Titan, the shark. The name whispered with fear and awe on Wall Street. Where was Daniel Fouquet, the boy who loved poetry and Dobos torta? He had murdered that boy, buried him under a mountain of stock portfolios and acquisition deals. Lily's check, the $250,000, was not an act of charity. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt at atonement. He knew it wouldn't fix anything. It was like trying to patch a dam with a banknote, but it was a start. It was the first decision he had made in 30 years that wasn't dictated by profit, leverage, or power. It was an act of something else. Humanity, perhaps. The word felt foreign on his tongue. Back at the restaurant, Lily was the reluctant center of a quiet storm. After Damien left, the staff descended upon her, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and gratitude. The $20,000 tip was an unheard-of windfall, a legend that would be told for years. "What did you say to him?" Thomas asked, his eyes wide. "It was like you cast a spell on him." Lily simply shook her head, the heavy check still clutched in her hand. "I just reminded him of home." Charles approached her, his demeanor completely changed. The anxious, sycophantic manager was gone. In his place was a man looking at her with profound respect. "Lily," he said quietly, "I was about to let you go. I was wrong. Whatever you did tonight, you may have saved this restaurant from a very powerful enemy, and you taught an old man a lesson." He gestured to the check. "You've earned that, and you will always have a job here for as long as you want it." Lily finished her shift in a dreamlike state. On the long subway ride home, she leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city lights blur past. The check was in her bag, a crisp, unbelievable reality. It was life-changing. It was freedom. Freedom from debt, from the constant anxiety of making rent, from the grinding exhaustion of her double life. She could finish her dissertation. She could travel to Hungary for her research, to the small villages where the dialects she studied were still spoken. She could walk the streets of Szeged and Budapest her grandmother had described. But it was more than the money. The encounter had affirmed the value of the one thing she had held on to, her grandmother's inheritance. The language, the stories, the connection to a place she'd never been. It wasn't just a sentimental relic. It was a living, breathing force. It had the power to shatter the defenses of the most powerful man she had ever met. It had bridged the chasm between a billionaire and a waitress, proving that beneath the layers of wealth and status, there are deeper, more fundamental currents that connect us all. She finally got to her apartment after 2 a.m. She didn't turn on the light. She walked to her small desk, where a framed black and white photograph sat. It was her grandmother, a young woman with fierce, intelligent eyes, standing on a bridge over the Danube. Lily took the check out of her bag and laid it on the desk in front of the photograph. "You see, Grandma? I didn't forget," she whispered into the quiet room, tears finally tracing paths down her tired face. "I didn't forget. The heart remembers. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it reminds others too." 6 weeks flowed by, the chaotic energy of a New York autumn mellowing into the stark, quiet beauty of early winter. The city, once a landscape of struggle and exhaustion for Lily, had become a place of discovery. The changes in her life were both monumental and subtle. The most obvious, of course, was the absence of dread. She no longer woke to the jarring shriek of a 4:30 a.m. alarm, her body already aching in anticipation of a 10-hour shift. Instead, she woke with the gentle morning light, the scent of brewing coffee replacing the memory of stale subway air, and industrial-strength cleaning fluid. Her days were now spent where she had always belonged, deep within the hallowed hushed halls of Columbia's Butler Library. She would find a secluded carrel on one of the upper floors, surrounded by towering stacks of books whose spines whispered of forgotten histories and arcane grammar. The air smelled of aged paper, leather, and focused thought, a perfume she found more intoxicating than any designer fragrance at Aurelia. Her world, once a frantic juggling act between serving truffle-infused entrees and deciphering proto-Uralic verb conjugations, had found its serene, singular focus. The constant, low-grade hum of financial anxiety that had been the soundtrack to her life for years had finally gone silent. The check, which she still sometimes thought of as a dreamlike artifact, had not just bought her time, it had bought her peace. She immersed herself in her dissertation with a fervor that had been impossible before. Her research traced the phonological decay of specific Hungarian dialects in isolated émigré communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania. It was niche, painstaking work that most people would find mind-numbingly dull, but for Lily, it was a sacred act of preservation. In the subtle shifts of a vowel sound, in the stubborn survival of an archaic turn of phrase, she could hear the echo of her grandmother's voice. She was not just a scholar, she was a keeper of memories, an archivist of ghosts. Yet amidst this newfound peace, a question lingered. She often found her mind drifting back to that bizarre, theatrical night at the restaurant. She would think of Damian Blackwood, not the cold monster who had tried to ruin her, but the broken man who had emerged in his place. Was his transformation real? Or was it a fleeting moment of emotional crisis, a temporary crack in his formidable armor that had long since been welded shut? The $250,000 felt both life-changing and strangely impersonal, a grand gesture from a man who solved every problem, including those of the soul, by writing a check. She wondered if he had simply paid his emotional toll and moved on, forgetting her and the language that had shattered his composure as quickly as he forgot a minor business deal. The answer arrived on a bitterly cold Tuesday in December. A light, determined snow was falling, dusting the campus grounds in a blanket of pristine white. Lily was heading out of the library, bundled in a scarf her grandmother had knit years ago, when she decided to check her departmental mailbox on a whim. It was usually filled with academic journals and department memos, but today, tucked between a newsletter and a flyer, was a large, heavy envelope that felt utterly out of place. It was made of a thick, cream-colored cardstock that felt like money itself. There was no personal name on the return address, only an embossed, elegant logo and the words, "The Alona Foundation, Park Avenue, New York." Lily's breath caught in the cold air. Ilona. He had spoken the name of his mother once, a mere whisper in the cacophony of that evening. She took the envelope and walked to a deserted bench beneath a snow-laden oak tree, her heart beginning to beat a heavy, nervous rhythm. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the seal. Inside, she found not one, but two documents. The first was a professionally printed brochure, folded into thirds. She opened it carefully. The cover featured a stunning, melancholic photograph of the Székely chain bridge in Budapest, its lights shimmering on the dark waters of the Danube. The text inside was crisp and professional. It announced the formation of a new nonprofit organization, the Alona Foundation. Lily scanned the mission statement, her eyes widening with every word. It was dedicated to a dual purpose: funding international scholarships for students of Hungarian language and cultural studies, and providing grants for heritage preservation projects within Hungary itself. Everything from restoring crumbling rural churches to digitizing archives of folk music and oral histories. Then she saw the founder's note at the bottom. It was brief and formal, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. The foundation had been established with an inaugural endowment of $50 million by its founder, Damian Blackwood, in loving memory of his mother, Ilona Fouquet. $50 million. The number was so vast it seemed fictional. This was no fleeting emotional gesture. This was an earthquake. This was the movement of mountains. He had taken the pain and shame he had carried for 30 years and transformed it into a legacy that would echo for generations. A woman whose memory he had tried to erase was now immortalized, her name a beacon for the very culture he had abandoned. Her hands shaking, Lily turned to the second document. It was a single sheet of the same heavy cardstock, bearing the foundation's letterhead. It was a personal letter, typed, but signed by hand with a bold, decisive flourish in black ink. "Dear Ms. Grace, I trust this letter finds you well. I expect that by now you are fully and deservedly engaged in the studies you so clearly value. Words are a curious thing. They can be used to build empires of commerce, as I have done, or they can be used to preserve empires of the soul, as you do. For 30 years I chose the former, believing them to be the only words of consequence. That night at Aurelia, with a simple proverb, you reminded me that a house built without a foundation is not a fortress, but a prison. You gave me a gift more valuable than you can imagine. You returned to me a part of my own history that I had systematically and ruthlessly chosen to abandon. It is a poor craftsman who blames his tools, and for years I blamed my own heritage for the hardships of my youth, rather than seeing it for the source of strength it was. You who held on to your inheritance with such grace and treated it as the treasure it is, showed me the true poverty of my own choices. Paying your tuition was not an act of generosity. It was the settling of a small part of a much larger and unpayable debt. This foundation is my attempt to begin addressing the rest. It is a formal apology to the memory of my mother and a promise to the ghost of the boy I used to be. I know that it will not change the past, that it cannot undo my failures. But it is my hope that it will help others to not make the same mistakes I did, to not be ashamed of where they come from, but to see it as a source of richness, identity, and strength. In recognition of the unique and pivotal role you played in the genesis of this mission, the board has named you the first honorary fellow of the Alona Foundation. This is not an award for which you need to apply, nor a position with any duties. It is a lifetime research grant established in perpetuity to support your academic work, wherever it may take you. It is yours unconditionally. Your grandmother was right. The heart remembers. You reminded mine how to do so. Sincerely, Damian Blackwood, Daniel Fakit. Lily read the letter once, then twice, the snowflakes melting on the thick paper like tears. The final two words, the ones in parentheses, were the most powerful statement of all. It was not a legal change of name, but a public and personal reclamation. It was an acknowledgement that the two identities, the ruthless American Titan and the hungry Hungarian boy, were not separate entities. They were and always had been the same man. She sat on the cold bench for a long time, the campus noise fading into a distant murmur. The story of the billionaire and the waitress was not about a bill. It was never about the money. It was about the quiet, enduring power of a mother's love, of a forgotten language, of a heritage that refuses to be buried. It was the story of how a few words, spoken from the heart, could travel back through time and heal a wound 30 years old, sparking a quiet revolution in one man's soul. And in doing so, he had created ripples of hope and remembrance that would touch countless lives, including her own, for years to come. In the end, Damian Blackwood had more than paid his bill. He had begun the long, arduous journey of paying a debt to himself, and Lily Grace, the keeper of memories, realized her work had just been given a legacy beyond her wildest dreams. Isn't it incredible how our past never truly leaves us? Damian Blackwood built an empire trying to outrun his, only to find that everything he was searching for was hidden in the language he left behind. Lily Grace's story reminds us that the things we inherit, our culture, our family stories, our language, are not burdens. They are our superpowers. In a world that often pushes us to forget where we come from in order to get ahead, maybe the real strength lies in remembering. The heart remembers what the mind forgets.